Hello guys, this is your friend, What Ifs and Short Stories, and this is What If Dick ran a cafe with Debbie and Toga. Chapter 11. Debbie currently looked like a phone monster covered in weird off-brand sprinkles. He was covered head to toe in the stuff inside fire extinguishers and burned popcorn, while Toga shrieked at the last few flames. Izuku had suggested that they could have a movie night once he was finished getting stationery from a local store for his, Koda's and possibly Toga's online classes. Izuku and Koda had gone to the store, leaving Debbie and Toga to pick out a movie. The blonde had tried making popcorn but couldn't figure out how to set up the new microwave. It didn't seem like a problem since she could just ask Debbie to use his quirk. She'd seen him heat drinks before, so popcorn shouldn't be too different. Right. Apparently it was very different. Popcorn doesn't just heat up, it pops. Which was apparently surprising for Toga and Debbie because they managed to pull out a few of Debbie's staples. The pain caused him to lose control of his fire, so Toga jumped in and used a fire extinguisher, covering Debbie in foam everywhere except his face. Maybe we should call Izuku and ask him to pick up some snacks. Good idea. Izuku slipped his phone back into his pocket, smiling at Koda while looking for popcorn, pizza rolls, and Debbie asked for Pringles, so he reluctantly put them in a basket too. They were too loud for a movie, but he didn't want to say no. Koda was making conversation, excitedly talking about his favorite places to climb or hike in the cafe. Apparently he could sit on the beams in the ceiling as long as the hot water wasn't running so the pipes didn't burn him. Izuku made a note to cover them with something so it would be safer for Koda. Hey, your water hoses, son. Your parents were really heroic for dying the way they did. A voice said behind them, then disappeared into the crowd. Koda was silent the rest of the way around the shop and on the way back to the cafe. Once they got back, Koda followed Izuku closely, and when they put a movie on, Toga chose Tangled. Koda curled into Izuku's side. Silent terror soaked the green-haired teen's head, but he didn't say anything, just wrapping an arm around Koda and letting him cry as much as he needed. Neither Toga or Debbie questioned the kid why he was crying. Toga just quietly ate the pizza rolls they got while Debbie threw pieces of popcorn into his mouth, ignoring the Pringles that he definitely only wanted so he could be loud. It was part of his charm. By the end of the second movie, Debbie chose Hercules. Koda had cried himself to sleep. Not wanting the kid to wake up stiff, Izuku picked him up and carried him to his room. Taking off his cap and tucking him into bed, he turned the nightlight on and turned to leave, but a small whimper made him hesitate. Izuku turned back around to see Koda staring at him with wide eyes. Clicking the door closed, he walked back into the room and sat on the end of the bed. Koda shuffled into his arms. Why does everyone say it's a good thing they died? The kid's voice was barely above a whisper, and if there was any other noise in the room, Izuku wouldn't have heard it. I don't know, it's hard to understand why people do a lot of things. Sometimes they do or say something because they're mean, sometimes they say it because they think it'll help. Some people say things to help themselves in their own grief. Koda's face fell a little. Izuku continued talking and wrapped his arms protectively around the child. But whatever they say, it's okay to feel anything you're feeling. You don't have to pretend like it was a good thing because it wasn't. There was a small pause and Koda looked up at Izuku with wide eyes. Your parents were amazing heroes, but they were your parents and you're allowed to grieve them in your own way. You don't have to understand what they did, because it's not something that anyone really knows. That doesn't make it right and it doesn't make it wrong, it just makes it a bad truth. Tears had started falling from the kid's eyes. No one had told Koda that he could. Could he be angry? He wasn't even sure if it was anger. You can be angry if that's what you need. Your feelings are valid and you don't need to pretend to be okay. You can be sad, angry, happy, or anything else you're feeling. Koda hadn't realized that he'd spoken out loud, but he was glad he did. He hurried his face in Easy's shirt and cried. Heart-wrenching sobs shook his body while Easy wasn't his dad, but he seemed like it. Maybe a brother or something. Easy held him close, protecting him from the bad thoughts that plagued his mind while Kota cried. Once the tears had slowed to small hiccups and he had his breath back, Kota mumbled a quiet thank you. Kota was sad that he'd lost his parents, but still happy Izu was there when he'd needed someone. Maybe he could ask Debbie what Izu was to him. The last thoughts began to rest in his mind before the dark at the sides of his eyes dragged into his vision and sleep took Kota for the night. Chapter 12. The bell above the door chimed as a man in dark jeans and a gray turtleneck jumper strode towards the counter. He glanced at the menu board for a moment before looking at Toga. Do you work here? The girl grinned. I might as well. What can I get for you? Compress spared a look around the room. I'll have a chai latte if you would be so kind. He spoke with a flamboyance and showmanship that Toga hadn't experienced before. It slightly unnerved her at first, but then she remembered what Izu-kun had said. People are all different. I want respite to be a place where everyone is welcome. She began wordlessly making the drink for the man. She put the mug on the counter and the man leaned forward slightly. Toga wasn't naive. She felt uncomfortable, but the man was dramatic so she couldn't tell his intentions. Signaling to Debbie so he could help if she needed it, Toga waited to hear what he had to say. I heard someone would be here. He goes by the name Cluo. That was easy enough to answer. Relaxing a little, she painted a smile back on her face. He just went out. He should be back soon if you want to wait though. She glanced over to make sure Debbie was still close by. Was he expecting you to show up? The man stood up, posing with one hand on a cane and feet crossed at the ankles. Not at a specific date or time, though we have spoken. Give him this. He'll know who it's from. The man pulled a blue marble from seemingly nowhere, handing it to Toga, then sat at an empty table with his drink. Izuku was visiting an area near the shopping district. Behind the colorful stalls there was a system of alleys pathways that led to the black market. It was hidden in a large warehouse between the good and bad parts of town. People could get anything there, as long as the deal was made peacefully, or if it turned violent then it was loyal. Simple as that. Information, weapons, drugs or rather underhand trades, whatever a person needed, they could find it in the black market. Izuku was currently visiting as Clue, a new informant who'd quickly grown by rumor in the underground. Not that he was complaining about his sudden popularity, he could always use the connections it gave him. He wanted to find out more information about the Hero Commission and apparently this was where he could find it. Dressed in all black apart from the small green accents on his head and pants, Izuku's face was also covered in a dark green mask and goggles that hid any distinguishing features. The mask doubled up as a voice changer and he had a dark green sleeveless turtleneck under the heavy. His hair was dyed black and he had a black beanie on to tame it as well as he could. The only problem was, he had no idea where he was going. Sticking to the shadows was working quite well. He could listen in on conversations and a meow at his feet caught his attention. An olive green Maine Coon was peering at his lips. Izuku hardly noticed the blood dripping until a known criminal fell into the alley. He was half falling from a rooftop, more of a failed rushed parkour stunt. He glared at the cat until he saw Izuku. The criminal was known for being a rapist and pervert. He was also extremely quirkish despite only having a voice alteration quirk, so Izuku had no issues with dealing with him. He sighed, pulling out a notebook and reading the criminal's name, all his family's names and a brief analysis of his quirk. He then looked up and glared at the now terrified man. He tried to act less afraid than he was while he spoke. How do you know that? Who the fuck are you? The man growled out. Izuku felt the presence of someone else on the roof, but pushed forward anyway, not sensing any danger from whoever it was. Clue, he said. Once the words were out, the man held his arms up in surrender. Listen dude, I don't want any trouble, the criminal stuttered over his words, suddenly a lot more apathetic in regards to acting fearless. Izuku cut him off. Turn yourself in, or your family will find out exactly what you've been up to. The man was now terrified, nodding and looking back the way he came. Izuku let out a low, growling hum. I was being chased, he stuttered. I don't know who it was. They had a snake quirk or something. He was cut off again as the person Izuku sensed on the roof dropped down. They restrained the criminal easily enough before turning to Izuku. Eraser, he greeted, not wanting to say the hero's full name in front of a criminal. The hero grunted in response before looking at the cat. It wasn't bleeding badly, just where the end of its tail had been injured. Izuku wrapped a bandage around the cut and scooped him up in his arms. She should be okay. He wasn't supposed to own the cafe's clue. I have a friend who can take care of her. The hero nodded. I would ask who you are, but I've heard enough to know. Clue. Izuku grinned under his mask. I was wondering how long you were on the roof. I'm surprised you waited as long as you did to drop down. He could tell Eraser was surprised, despite how the hero tried to hide it. Anyway, it's nice to finally meet you. I'll let you deal with Shinzu. I should go and take this one to her new home. He gestured to the cat and began to walk away when the hero called out to him. How can I contact you? The hero asked. Ask Izuku. If he isn't around, then anyone else who works at Respite will know how to get a message to me. With that, he turned back around and left in the direction of Respite Cafe, pushing the door open with an armful of cat, while in his full Clue outfit caused about as much chaos as he'd expect. Toga squealed. Debbie just stared in shock. Kota ran over and inspected the cat in his arms, staying huffed, and a few customers Kuda moved closer while some shuffled away. All in all, no one knew how to react to seeing Clue with an injured cat in his arms. He simply walked into the back, followed by Toga and Kota. Debbie stood outside the door as a type of guard. A few minutes later, Toga walked out of Izuku, using her quirk, and Izuku followed wearing his Clue outfit. He still needed to hide his identity, so Toga agreed to use her quirk so Izuku and Clue could be seen together. Once Izuku had changed out of his Clue outfit and Toga was back to herself, Izuku, Toga, Debbie and Kota all sat around the table so they could think of a name for the cat. So far, the options were Bastard, Maya or Green 2.0, but none of the options really seemed to fit. Debbie was the one who spoke up. If she's going to live here, shouldn't her name represent the cafe? Zero was going to name the place Olive Branch before he named it Respite. Kota tilted his head, mirroring the cat in front of him with his hands buried in her fur. Why Olive Branch? It's a symbol for peace. It'd fit for a place where everyone comes for peace from everything. Toga chirped, sipping on a into I like Respite too. It means a delay or cessation for a time, especially of anything distressing or trying, otherwise called an interval of relief according to the dictionary in Easy's room. Kota grinned. The others in the room glanced at each other, and it was Izuku who spoke. Yeah, did you memorize the dictionary? Kota nodded, happily playing with the cat's fur and looking more relaxed than he had in a while. The others decided not to question it for now. They'd definitely talk more about Kota later, when he wasn't around to worry. For now though, I like Olive Branch. It suits her and we could call her Olive for short. Toga set eyes looking between the cat and everyone else in the room. Debbie shrugged, Izuku smiled and nodded. Kota also nodded in agreement. Once they'd settled on the name, Debbie went to get supplies that they'd need. Kota went to show Olive around the cafe. Toga held Izuku back a moment to talk. We had a customer asking for Clue earlier. He had this weird dramatic flair. Anyway, he said to give you this. She held out a small blue marble. Said you'd know what it was. She let Izuku pick up the marble, rolling it over in his hands. I met someone on a chess site. He said he needed more practice with his quirk before he fully took over the family business. Izuku looked up from the small object. "I'll message him to come again tomorrow if we can." They both heard a bell chime and a certain underground hero appeared, covered in some sort of green mud and was outblood. Izuku and Dabi rushed over just in time to catch Eraser as he collapsed. Chapter 13. Izuku and Toga heard a bell chime as a certain underground hero appeared, covered in some sort of green mud and was outblood. Both Izuku and Dabi rushed over from different sides of the room just in time to catch Eraser as he collapsed, falling onto that fire user while Izuku rushed to check the hero for injuries. There was a lot of blood, but it didn't seem to come from anywhere. Respite was between the hospital and Eraserhead's patrol area, so it half made sense why the hero decided to stop at the cafe before he blacked out. It just didn't make sense why he was here. Why did the hero black out, and what did he get himself into after Clue left with Olive Branch? Toga ushered Koda away. He didn't seem to be doing too bad, but they all knew what adrenaline could do when a person was in fight or flight. It didn't look like the hero was bleeding. Dabi had some medical experience, so he carried the hero into one of the rooms upstairs. There was an unused mattress that could serve as a hospital bed until they knew what else to do. Izuku slipped back into his Clue persona and tried to call Tsukauchira Hospital. Unfortunately, hospitals didn't deal with anyone on this side of town. They didn't want to waste medical supplies on villains, meaning anyone without flashy quirks. Tsukauchi would have helped, but the receptionist at the station assumed he was just playing a prank or something, so he couldn't get through. Clue might have power in the underground, but it was different for spotlight things. He'd have to work on that. Unfortunately, all they could do was wait for the hero to wake up. He was in a room with a locking door, so no one could get in without permission. It had made sure the hero was safe and they could clean the scarf too so it wasn't covered in dried blood. Eraser woke up and his head was pounding. There was distant noise that sounded like the restaurant. Opening his eyes slightly, he wasn't greeted with harsh hospital lights. Only a small room with nothing but a bed and a safe in the corner. He really should have expected a kidnapping. The last thing he remembers is getting hit over the head, so it wasn't that surprising. All Eraser had to do was figure out how long he'd been here and who kidnapped him. Standing up, he looked around the room. Of course, his capture weapon, knives, phone, was all gone, so he'd have to be smart about whatever he did. As he was thinking out his next steps, the sound of a key in the lock drew his attention to the door. It swung open and a short figure stepped into the room with an armful of something. They seemed to look over Eraser and the room for a moment before their green eyes widened. "You're awake," Izuku said, smiling and moving over to the safe in the corner and depositing whatever he had in his arms on top. "How are you feeling?" he asked, moving closer and tilting his head to similar to a cat. The hero just blinked, deciding to go along for now until he knew more. "Like I got hit over the head with a brick," he said dryly. "Where am I?" Izuku nodded. "I'll get Dabi to come and make sure you're okay enough to use your phone. You're in respite, by the way. Clue left use his room since he isn't here anyway." The green-haired kid clipped the door closed, leaving the key in the lock and something on the safe. A few moments later, Dabi walked in with a bag. Eraser didn't know what was inside and forced himself not to panic. He didn't fully understand what was going on, but he still had a chance to escape if anything went badly. Toga was stood in the doorway, so he still had to wait for the best chance to escape. "You look okay. How's your vision? Any changes since you took that hit?" Dabi asked. Eraser hadn't even noticed the man get close to him. He shook his head slightly, ignoring the dull ache in his back and neck. "Okay, Toga, you want to get his phone so he can call the detective." He couldn't stand it. "What's going on?" That seemed to make Dabi freeze. "What do you mean?" the man asked, shoving his hands in his pockets. I have some questions. Eraser sat up further, giving himself more freedom to move and escape if he needed it. Ask away, Debbie said plainly. How long have I been here? It's been 9 hours since you got here. I'd assume you hadn't been injured much longer than that. I haven't spoken to Clue yet about what happened. His voice gave away nothing, equally monotone and gruff from what the hero assumed was cigarettes. And what happened that you know of? You took a hit. Respite was closer than the hospital or police station. Your phone was dead when you got here, so we charged it. You passed out. We dragged you to Clue's room and waited for you to wake up so you could call someone. Here we are. The hero blinked a few times, so I this isn't a kidnapping and a hostage situation. Debbie just looked at him and slowly blinked like he was done with everything. Dude, we have a kid in a cinnamon roll living here. There's no way he didn't expect that. Right, the hero responded dumbly. At that moment the door swung open. Clue was covered in post-it notes and had red string on his voice changer with his eyes glaring at the safe. He walked across the room and began angrily typing on a laptop. He seemed to be muttering something while he typed. Eraser couldn't focus on the words though. Debbie didn't seem fazed by the other present, so he decided to ignore the paranoia in the back of his mind. After a few minutes, Clue turned to Eraser. Shinju, that vigilante said, like that made any sense. Once he saw the confusion, he continued, it was Shinju's brother who did this to Eraser. I just need a few hours to get a confession. Once he's arrested, we can make sure Hitoshi and his mother are both safe. Clue continues, furiously typing. Slow down. I think Rizu and Toga took Koda to the park so he wouldn't be around Bloodor. Debbie gestured to the hero. Clue nodded, thinking about Koda. He should go and meet Toga at the park. He was crying once the adrenaline wore off, and being around injured heroes was definitely a trigger for him. Izuku would have to talk to the kid about some therapy at some point. Eraser looked between the two when Clue turned to him and spoke. You should call someone to come here so you don't have to go anywhere while you're injured. I'll be in contact about the person who attacked you. The informant wrote a number down and handed the hero's phone to Eraser before walking back out of the room, this time with the laptop. Debbie shrugged, walking out too but leaving the door open this time. Eraser didn't know what to do. Clue had made it clear he couldn't leave unless he called someone, but who could he call? He decided to send a message to Tsukauchi before laying back and closing his eyes. Chapter 14. Koda was. Emotions are annoying. He didn't know how he was supposed to feel. He'd seen hero fights before. They were common enough on TV and the people in the cafe talked about them too. He'd even experienced the worst parts of heroics. He knew that you can never win every fight. So why did seeing Eraser knocked out hurt so much? He hadn't even thought about stories for the other kids' lives at the park with Toga because he was worried about the hero. He cried a little after Debbie fixed the hero and Zook called people as Clue. He wasn't sure what happened after he went to the park with Toga, but apparently Zook had used his Clue costume to hide his identity with Toga. Oh. He had to remember that the spare room was allegedly for Clue. Anyway, he still didn't understand why seeing a hero asleep hurt. He just kept thinking about his parents, but he talked to Zook about that and they said it was okay to feel about his parents. But what about other heroes? Koda pulled a notebook out of his pocket and began writing questions to ask Zook. He still wanted to find out more about emotions. He could use the computer too. He'd ask to use the computer first, then ask Zook anything he couldn't find there. If Zook had learned one thing since he started looking for information about how Eraser got hurt, it was that he hated most, if not all, of the Shinzus. He'd met the mother as Clue to see if she knew where her brother-in-law would be. She told him to fuck off or something. He'd gone back to the rundown apartment later that night while she wasn't there and tried to look around. The first thing we noticed was the smell. Beyond the door was a thick smell of cigarette smoke and alcohol mixed with the standard stench of garbage and anything else mixed in. The next thing we noticed was a lack of family photos, the broken beer bottles and stains on the walls and floor. He didn't dare take his shoes off since the carpet felt sticky underfoot and a noise called his attention to a scratched and water-damaged door. Was that blood? With little hesitation he moved forward, pressing his ear to the door and hearing a very muffled, heart-wrenching, pained sob. He tapped on the door quietly and the noises disappeared. Taking a step back, Izuklu took a deep breath and reached for his lock-picking kit. After a few minutes, he managed to pry the door open, revealing a dark, filthy room. It was difficult to see anything, but there was clearly dried blood on the walls and floor. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust, but once he could see clearer, he noticed the hunched-over figure in the corner. It wasn't looking good, but he moved forward, telegraphing his movements and reaching for a first-aid kit. When Shoto woke up, the first thing he saw was a child sat rotting at his feet. After a second, he remembered where he was. Then it clicked together. Kodo was reading while Shoto was asleep, and he was in respite after getting knocked out in a fight. Kodo looked up from the book. Zook said, "You need to drink some water when you woke up," the kid said matter-of-factly before going back to reading. Was that English? He wasn't familiar with the book, The Great Gatsby. Shoto made a note to ask Zeshi once he got home. He took a sip of water, checking to see it wasn't drugged or anything. Paranoia is just a small part of underground heroics. Once it was deemed safe, he took a longer drink waiting and began the tedious task of waiting for. It had only been a few minutes when a thought hit him. How long was I out? The hero hadn't realized he'd spoken out loud until Kodo gave a response. 9 hours, the first time. Then you fell asleep for 10 hours after Debbie checked on you. He went back to reading. The hero only nodded, unsure how to handle a child who wasn't in crisis or dealing with a very current traumatic event. Kodo was dealing with trauma, but he seemed not terrible. Cats were easier to deal with. He wished his longtime crush best friend was here. Zeshi was better at handling kids than he was. Flopping back against the bed, he resigned his fate to be stuck here waiting for a detective who didn't check his phone enough. He didn't want to worry his best friend, though, so he didn't mind waiting. What seemed like hours passed. It was only 10 minutes when Kodo spoke again. "You're not as hurt anymore. You can probably just go if you need to get home." The hero thought about it for a minute before standing and moving to get his things. Kodo walked past him and unlocked the safe with a thumbprint so the hero could get his belongings. Pockets properly filled and capture weapon back around his neck, the hero walked towards the door, only hesitating for a second before he walked out of the room. He ordered a black coffee to go from Izukan and left. Something seemed vaguely off with the barista, but he wasn't going to question it. He made sure the hero was alright, telling him to come again soon and to be more careful in the future. Coffee in hand, he left respite and went home to his cats. Chapter 15. Clue was ready to drag the whole Shinzo family through the mud. Who the fuck keeps a child in a filthy, blood-covered and generally unsafe room? No. Focus on the task at hand. The figure in the corner looked like they were on death's doorstep and simply waiting for the right moment to die. Their eyes opened, staring at Clue while looking terrified. The muzzle of their face was tight, breaking skin and leaving smeared blood on their cheeks. It looked awful. He'd seen this kind before. They were advertised for villainous quirks and very illegal. He opened his mouth to speak but realized that his voice would only sound robotic. Pulling off the mask, he held his hands out so he wouldn't seem as threatening. After a moment Hitoshi seemed to break down, letting silent tears fall from their eyes. "Hey, I'm going to cut the muzzle off. It'll hurt a little, but just like ripping off a band-aid, it was true. It hurt a bit. It wasn't the worst pain in the world though. The kid nodded slowly. They flinched every time Clue moved and seemed to struggle staying still while he cut the muzzle, not for lack of trying however, more just the pain from the god-awful torture device. It took a few minutes for him to cut the kid free. Once he broke through the leather they just stared at him blankly. Clue waited for them to move, leaning back slightly to give the kid some space. He was ignoring the fact that they were the same age for now. He didn't want to break down as Clue. That had come later when he could deal with his own trauma. But not now. After a moment, Hitoshi signed Y. With trembling hands. Clue didn't know how to respond, because they didn't deserve anything back that had happened. Because everyone deserved to be saved. It all just sounded like the wrong thing to say. Instead he shrugged, replying with "because you needed help." Hitoshi looked skeptical at his response. "Okay, that's not all of it. I promise I'll explain more later. Right now though, we should get out of here so your cuts don't get infected." They nodded, ready to move, then hesitated. "Do you know my quirk?" The kid signed. Clue instantly nodded. Voice activated brainwashing. "I'm sorry for looking into it before I met you." They seemed slightly hesitant, tension in their body clear. "And you're not afraid of me?" they stuttered, struggling to speak with the damage to their face. He noticed that the kid didn't phrase it as a question. He'd have to come back to that later. Anyone at the cafe would have been confused, for the good or the bad Clue was all too familiar with the worry and fear. "Never. You're not a bad person and your quirk doesn't make you a villain." He hated to rush, but they should really leave soon. A wave crashed into his chest, soaking through his shirt and rubbing blood onto the material. He didn't move, letting Hitoshi cry as much as they needed, because clearly, no one had been there for them and society had really fucked up again. Clue vowed to keep Hitoshi safe, sending a quick message to Debbie to set up one of the spare rooms before rubbing circles into the kid's back. The way he was nuzzling into Clue's shirt mildly resembled a cat biting its head against someone's hand. Hitoshi was like a stray kitten. Hurt, abandoned and abused, and clearly in need of a family and a home. He vaguely heard the door close, pulling his mask back on and putting everything back into the bag, including the muzzle. He planned to trace a supplier and end their whole career. Then picking up Hitoshi, Clue silently moved through the apartment and out of a window, snapping a few pictures for a police report and tip on the way. He walked a good distance away from the apartment building while holding Hitoshi before he stopped in a park, finding a bench and letting them sit down. Hitoshi felt pathetic. They probably made the person who saved them mad because of all the crying. Maybe they'd put another muzzle on them and it wouldn't be anyone's fault but their own. Maybe they only stopped to beat them up. Maybe, Hitoshi, a voice broke through their thoughts. "Hitoshi, I need you to copy my breathing." No, they were hyperventilating. It took a while but they managed to copy the breathing patterns. Then, once they were calm, their focus came back and they noticed fully what the person who saved them looked like. They were short, dressed in all black but with green accents. They had a lot of freckles. Strange, Hitoshi swore they had a mask on earlier. Why would they take it off? Hitoshi hadn't done anything to deserve learning a hero's identity. But could they be a hero if they looked so young? The aging quirk. They noticed the hero, waiting for them to speak or do something. "Thank you," they signed, "for saving me." "You can speak, there's no pressure, but you can talk or ask questions or anything. You can still sign too if that's what you're comfortable with," the person said. Hitoshi wasn't sure. They didn't know how to trust people. But maybe. "Who are you?" they asked, waiting for the fist to come down and heard. "Oh, sorry, I forgot about that part." My name's Hizuki, or Clue. I'll explain more about that later, but basically I'm an anonymous informant who also owns a cafe that doubles up as a safe zone so anyone can go and feel safe and they don't have to worry about anything. If you want, you can live there with me and a few others, or I can help you find anything else. I think that's everything. They watched Hizuki ramble in shock. A safe zone. He was offering them a place to stay. Oh. My pronouns are he/him and I'm Quirkles, but not many people know that. Hizuki gave a small reassuring smile as though he hadn't just dropped a bomb. Hitoshi didn't know how to respond. Quirkles. It wasn't bad, they didn't care. If anything, it was almost good wasn't the right word. Maybe he'd understand the hate and bullying. Maybe they could talk about it with him. Not yet though, he was still new and virtually unknown to Hitoshi, but they could learn how to trust Hizuki. I use they/them pronouns, and I don't care about the Quirkles thing. I won't tell anyone either. They dropped their gaze to the floor, not able to look Hizuki in his eyes when they asked, "You really wouldn't mind me living with you?" Hizuki smiled. "If that's what you want." Hitoshi nodded, eyes almost leaking tears as they leaned into Hizuki's shoulder. Hopefully he wouldn't mind letting them cry again. As the tears slowed, their eyes grew heavy and dropped shut until the last thought before they fell asleep was maybe having a new family wouldn't be so bad. Someone was going to die. It'd be their own fault too. Who the fuck tells a kid their parents were dying so there wouldn't have to be parents anymore? It upset Koda and Dabi was pissed. He was going to kill that pathetic son of a bitch. He didn't give a fuck who was nearby. Erased that detective Easy was friends with. It didn't matter. All that did matter was someone had hurt his family and they were going to die for it. On second thought, maybe not in the cafe, known for being peaceful and safe. It had upset Izu. Marching over to the board of banished names, he scribbled the description of the man who was stupid enough to upset Koda. Purple hair, yellow eyes, scar over right eye, looks too awake for normal times in the morning. Marching back to the murder bait, he dragged him towards the front entrance and out of the door. Eraser simply shrugged and went back to drinking coffee, ignoring the cafe security in favor of petting Olive. He vaguely remembered a reporter in the area who was looking for the new vigilante. Hopefully Dabi wouldn't do anything stupid on camera. Looking over to Koda, he seemed completely shut down. Toga was fussing around him and trying to cheer him up, but Koda just hugged the green heady that Easycom gave him before he went out. Shada didn't know what to do. He really didn't know what to do with kids. No one questioned why Clue was carrying a teen on his back when he walked in. A few people looked confused when Dabi returned with the man he'd just thrown out. Only this time he dragged him behind a door next to the kitchen. Clue disappeared upstairs with the teen, to the room Shada was treated in. It seemed plausible. 20 minutes later, a loud scream was heard from behind the door and Clue walked out, a fiercely protective look in his eyes as he disappeared back upstairs to change back into his civilian clothes and tell Dabi, Toga and Koda about the newest member of Respite. Chapter 16. So, I'm getting a new sibling? Koda asked innocently while unknowingly melting Hizuki, Dabi and Toga's hearts. Hizuki was the first to recover and spoke up. Maybe, but for now Hitoshi just needs a place to stay. We can ask them if they'd like this to be long-term or not, but for now let's not overwhelm them. Koda nodded, then looked confused for a moment. Dabi gave the kid a questioning look, but he seemed to miss it. What are you thinking, kid? He asked, catching Koda's attention. We need another name badge for Hitoshi. They should have 1 2 once again. Koda melted hearts. Toga jumped up. Yes. I can make one for them. Do they actually like purple, or is it just the same color as their hair? Before anyone had a chance to respond, a small knock sounded at the door. Hitoshi stood, fidgeting with her hands for something to do and looking too exhausted for someone their age. They signed hello nervously, but it was only picked up by Izuku and Koda, who beamed at the purple-haired teen using sign as he jumped up and began mumbling along to sign. All questions like what's your favorite color? Do you like chocolate chip pancakes for breakfast? What's your favorite animal? The flow of questions seemed to overwhelm Hitoshi, and they took a small step back. Toga scooped up the kid while Izuku moved forward to guide Hitoshi to a chair. Okay, this is Hitoshi. You already know about their pronouns, and they mostly use signs, so if Toga or Dabi need a translator, then ask myself or Kota, Izuku said to the room. Everyone nodded, glancing over to the purple-haired teen. They moved closer to Izuku, grabbing into his sleeve for comfort and an anchor. No one said anything about it, and it made them feel a little more relaxed. If Izuku said that he trusted these people, then maybe Hitoshi could too. They'd try at least. This is Toga, Dabi and Koda. She/her and the other two you/him, Izuku said, pointing to each person respectively. The bell for the cafe chimed and Toga ran to the counter, leaving Dabi, Koda, Izuku and Hitoshi. Dabi seemed to notice how much Koda was trying not to wave his hands around, so he let the kid play with a piece of fabric on his coat. He'd never admit that he'd sewn it, and so the kid could use it as a comfort if he was overstimulated or just overwhelmed in general. The fabric was made from one of his old t-shirts that didn't fit anymore, and they seemed to like the texture, so it wasn't a problem. Koda ended up dragging Dabi out of the room so he could check some theories about court fire and regular fire he'd read in a book about evolution. It left Izuku and Hitoshi alone, the latter letting out a breath of almost relief. Then something hit them. Koda, they mumbled, causing Izuku to look up and meet their eyes. I think he's autistic. They looked away, expecting pain or some sort of consequence for speaking, but remembered that nothing would come, and glanced up to see Izuku lost in thought. I'll look into getting him a test, he said, looking out towards where Koda was playing with Olive, looking very relaxed and talking to Dabi about something, most likely a new book. He's a good kid. I knew he was different, but I didn't know how to help, so thank you. That surprised them. They hadn't expected to be allowed to speak, let alone to be thanked for it. Hitoshi just nodded, unsure how to respond, and grabbed onto Izuku's sleeve again. Their throat felt like it was closing up and it hurt to talk. Izuku seemed to understand and let them follow him around the cafe as he spoke to customers. Hitoshi watched as Izuku moved around people, socializing as though it was nothing, but how he was also careful. How he kept his distance from anyone who wasn't Dabi, Toga, Koda or Hitoshi, though was Izuku would hide flinches whenever there was a loud noise. They say broken people know broken people, and it was true. Hitoshi recognized something in a lot of people in the cafe that they saw in themselves. They noticed it in Dabi and in Toga and Koda, but more than anyone, they saw a deeply buried hurt in Izuku that they'd only seen in themselves before. Sure, Dabi reeked of daddy issues and trauma. It only matched with the cigarette smell, and Toga clearly had trust issues, most likely from an unaccepting family. Koda had lost his parents as heroes and undiagnosed autism. But Izuku was helping everyone else while ignoring his own mental health. He was going to burn out, and they'd be the person whose unintentional trauma dumping put him over the edge. Hitoshi swore they'd protect Izuku and try to help him fight the skeletons he kept in the back of the closet. Maybe, eventually, they could bring up their dream of becoming a hero, but for now, helping Izuku would be enough. Chapter 17. Hitoshi looked around the room. It was dark out, so the cafe was quieter than usual. Only two people sat at different tables, one in a booth asleep and the other staring into space. It was peaceful. They didn't want to disturb anyone, so they decided to go into the small room. It wasn't a bad room, but it reminded them of, no. This wasn't that. This was respite. This was safe. Thinking back, they realized just how much had happened in the past day. 2 days. How long had it been? Regardless, They'd escaped with the help of Izuku, who offered them a place to stay and even used the correct pronouns and name. They didn't know how Izuku knew, but they didn't want to ask questions. He told Toga, Kota and Dabi their correct name and pronouns too, and they all respected them. It was weird, but in a good way. Actually, they were half wondering if they heard Kota ask if they were his new siblings. He seemed enthusiastic enough about it and not at all upset. It'd be nice to have a real family, if Izuku and his family would want them. What was he talking about? As if they'd want someone like him. No. Izuku said they were welcome to stay and they trusted him. Izuku had saved them, so he wouldn't mind if they stayed around. Even if that's all it was, and they didn't get to have a family, at least they were safe. He doesn't deserve it. He was a burden for everything, and the one person who cared only cared out of pity, and their breath got thinner. Butterflies in their stomach flew to suffocate them, and everything distorted. With walls closing in, the room got darker, outlines of red paint onto the walls, and they couldn't breathe. Why couldn't they breathe? Because he was too stupid and he didn't deserve it. No, boy. No, he. No, useless burden. No, villain. No, H. Just stop. How dare he expect other people to use his pronouns when the voice in his head refused to? He was a boy and he shouldn't be such a burden. Their head screamed. It screamed like Mom, but merged his and Dad's and Uncle's voices into one that hated them the most. They didn't understand how anyone could hate them as much as they hated themselves, but somehow Mom, Dad and Uncle managed it. The words lost meaning after a while, and Hitoshi realized that they didn't have parents. They had a mom and a dad and uncle, but that wasn't family, and they didn't care about Hitoshi. They still called him H, just like the voice. They reached and pulled at their hair, scratching the place where the muzzle should be. They didn't deserve this. They didn't deserve to be safe. They didn't deserve to burden other people with their existence, and they shouldn't make Izuku worry because he'd already done so much for them. They felt the gentle hands holding their own in a soft fabric where his fingernails were supposed to be hurting. He deserved pain. Strong arms held their own away from grabbing at their hair, and they struggled to find where they were or who is with them. Who knows, he's such a pathetic villain. Hitoshi, good person, they slashed them, worthy, the person said. It sounded distant, but Hitoshi felt themselves leaning into the voice. It sounded like Izuku, and when their head found a shoulder, they let their tears fall. He didn't deserve this. But Izuku said they could be selfish, because it wasn't selfish to care about your own well-being. Izuku would be so disappointed if he'd understand. Hitoshi cut the voice off, gripping onto that fabric of Izuku's sleeve that helped to ground them and let them come back to the present. After a while of crying into the soft fabric, they managed to control their breathing and sit back up. There was a heady in front of them, specks of blood on it and crescent cuts in the palms of their hands where their fingernails had broken skin. Their face was wet with tears, but the cuts from the muzzle had broken open and left more blood on their face. So much blood. It would be hard to clean, and it'd take Izuku's time away from his work as Clue, and wouldn't be needed to do anything for the cafe or look after Kota, and Hitoshi had already given him more to do by existing, and they didn't deserve the kindness or the comfort that Izuku had shown them. Hitoshi felt like a burden. But looking up to see Izuku showed only concern as Izuku checked out they were okay. Izuku said they weren't a burden on the way to the cafe. He'd said that Hitoshi's quirk didn't define them, and even mumbled about how angry he was with anyone who thought muzzling a child was okay, though Hitoshi didn't think they were supposed to hear that. Anyway, they looked back to Izuku and nodded to show that they were okay. He didn't press, but still looked a little worried about the cuts and blood. Hitoshi was glad he didn't ask too much or force them to talk. It was strange but not unexpected, but still surprising. They didn't expect Izuku to be mean or do anything wrong, but it was still nice that he cared about Hitoshi like they were family, even though they just met him. It was a nice change, but they might need time to get used to healthy boundaries being respected. Izuku said something, but it didn't process right now. All Hitoshi could think about was the 4 simple things he'd said earlier. Hitoshi, good person, they slashed them. Worthy Izuku had heard their panic attack. He'd heard the things Hitoshi thought about themselves. He was going to. He corrected every bad thing the voice in their head had screamed at them for years and stopped Hitoshi hurting themselves while they were panicking. Izuku had listened. Later that night, Hitoshi found themselves watching a pre-work show about lesbians and swords and somehow a magic horse with Izuku while they held on to his sleeve for comfort. Everything was new and it was honestly a lot, but Hitoshi found that they didn't mind. They liked the cafe and that Izuku respected their boundaries and that they had someone looking out for them and taking care of them. Maybe having a new family would be nice. Chapter 18 Himiko grimaced as she recognized the person who appeared in the doorway. He gave her the creeps, didn't like quirks, but said how much he had to use to stop his granddaughter going out of control. He wasn't old enough to be a grandparent. She didn't care about the aversion to germs, but he took it a bit far. Things he couldn't help were understandable, but when he made his entire personality avoiding people, it got a bit weird. How he only spoke to Izuku because he was quirkless and how he'd said Dabi's scars looked filthy. Izuku didn't seem to mind his behavior, so she stayed quiet and didn't mention how uncomfortable he made her or how mean he was to her Dabi. Dabi had become something of an older brother for her since she moved in. Then Koto was the baby and Izuku was also her brother. Hopefully Toshi would want to be her sibling too, but that was their choice. For now they were like a family friend that was virtually part of the family already, but she hoped Toshi wanted it to be official. Anyway, she still failed to smile while serving the strange man and just stayed nearby while he talked to Izuku. He was still a customer and didn't cause any trouble, so she'd ignore the unease for now. Tuning back into the conversation, Himiko caught herself up. Strange man was talking about his granddaughter again. Easy looked like he was nodding along and Toshi was watching and nodding along while they held on to Izuku's sleeve. She has a transformation type curse. Whenever she uses it, her horn grows bigger and she starts glowing, the man said. He sounded annoyed at his granddaughter for something. Izuku's eyes brightened as he spoke. Oh, well, I don't know for sure, but that sounds more like an emitter quirk with a minor mutation. It's really interesting really. I'm sorry, why is he holding your arm like that? If he's cursed too, then shouldn't he be keeping distance so he doesn't damage you? The man interrupted Izuku. Before she had time to process that, she realized who he was talking about. Strange man misgendered Toshi. Toga way into cutting and not in the pretty way. Hitoshi uses they/them pronouns and their relationship with Izuku is none of your concern, she spat out, noticing Koda stood beside her and pushing him behind her protectively while glaring at the man. Seemingly wishing for death, he scoffed. Well, that's stupid. He turned to Hitoshi, who was trembling with the beginning of a panic attack. I'm not going to use that. It's grammatically wrong. She reached for a knife. Izuku's eyes darkened and Dabi moved to take Toshi away from the situation. But before anyone had a chance, Koda appeared in the middle of the group and spoke up. Actually, up until the 1800s, they was actually the main pronoun used to describe a single person. Not only was it used in public, but also by English writers like Shakespeare and Jane Austen, who are somewhat responsible for parts of the English language as we know it. The only reason it was changed is because around the 18th century, English critics decided they wanted English to be more like Latin, which meant not using supposedly plural pronouns in singular contexts, leaving us with and she. Lots of people were annoyed because they wanted a singular pronoun, so people started using he as the generic pronoun. But at Harvard in the 1970s, feminists were understandably and rightfully against the use of he as the default pronoun. But Harvard professors didn't want to lose their Latin language and returned to using they. students and professors tried a lot of other words for a non-gendered singular pronoun, many of which are still in use like zes and v, which can both be used as neopronouns alongside many others. All of this is quite simple to understand. I'm only 5, and if I can understand that languages change and adapt all the time, then old people like you should be able to understand too. In summary, and also for any language traditionalists, the singular use of they and them has been perfectly fine for a long time. By the time he was done with his speech, the cafe was silent. Hitoshi had stopped trembling, and Kota looked quite pleased with himself for a moment before turning to Izuku, who just nodded at him. Chisaki looked shocked. After a moment he recomposed himself and turned to Izuku. "You're not going to allow this in your cafe, are you?" he asked incredulously. Izuku grinned, looking more foul than anyone had seen him. "If you're talking about my family standing up for each other, then yes. And I'm proud of them for doing so. If you decide not to respect them, then I suggest you leave." His voice was low, dangerous. Before anyone had chance to react, Debbie was moving to escort Chisaki out of the door. Most people in the cafe also moved to follow him outside, but as long as no one was causing trouble and respite, it didn't bother Izuku or anyone else. He ruffled Kota's hair, telling him he was proud before turning to Toshi and guiding them out of view of the door or window so they didn't have to watch anything that happened as a consequence of bigotry, ignorance and princephobia outside. They didn't say anything for the rest of the day, only nodding or shaking their head if anyone asked them a question. The dissociation lasted until later that night. Kota had gone over to Hitoshi and handed them a coloring book. He sat down next to the teen and just silently shared the space with them while Izuku, Debbie and Toga cleaned up from the day. Hitoshi seemed to relax, talking to Kota in sign language and listening to him talk about English literature. Hitoshi managed to keep up with Kota, and they even put their own thoughts forward and responded. It was nice that Kota had someone who understood him, but it was also good that Hitoshi could relax enough to communicate with someone other than Izuku. "How did you know all that, everything that you told Chisaki?" Hitoshi signed to Kota, the sign name for Chisaki being similar to discount bird. "Oh," he paused and is ready for a moment. Izuku said that use they/them pronouns and that we can refer to you with gender-neutral terms. "I did some research so I'd understand before meeting you, so I didn't get anything wrong." He looked like he wanted to say more, so Hitoshi waited while Kota figured out what he needed to say. He twisted his hands together, followed pawed her way onto his lap and let him relax a little by playing with her fur so he wouldn't accidentally hurt himself. "I read online that it could feel like people don't believe you're real or your own person if people misgender you. I know it's different, but I think that's sort of how I feel when people call me water hose's son. I know that I used to be and that I sort of still am, but it's different and I still want to be my own person. I don't want you to feel like you don't exist because you do, and anyone who says you don't is wrong and stupid." And the words only Debbie knew. Says Kota looked up to see Hitoshi. They looked. "Are you happy?" he asked, getting a nod in response. After a second, Hitoshi spoke. "You're your own person too," was all they said, but Kota seemed content enough with the response and went back to writing. Hitoshi went back to sketching, enjoying the quiet presence of someone else. They definitely wouldn't mind a new family, if this one would let them be part. Izuku had said they were family earlier, so maybe they had a chance, but he'd also said that to the homophobes, so they couldn't be sure if he meant it or not. Chapter 19. Izuku took a glance around the cafe and put a sign in the window that said it was closed for the night. Everyone seemed like they needed a break after today, himself included. Izuku had missed so many red flags and all because he was too selfish to see past the metaphorical rose-tinted glasses that just showed acceptance instead of the usual hate and quirkist ignorance that he was used to. He hadn't even noticed how uncomfortable Himi-chan looked whenever he was around. He hadn't seen how protective Debbie always was, and his blindness led to Hitoshi being misgendered and hurt. Izuku had let them down and failed all over again. So he did what he did best. Everything was falling apart around him, so he ran. Pulling on his vigilante outfit, Izuku disappeared into the night as Clue. Running over rooftops and breaking up fights by mentioning his name, it cleared his head just enough. Actually, it didn't clear anything, it just distracted him. With burning muscles and frozen fingertips, he found himself on the edge of a building watching out over the undesirable part of town. It had a bittersweet moment that left his heart empty but filled knowing everyone would notice if he decided to take the swan dive. It was nice not to have to talk himself out of it for once. Taking a deep breath of air and closing his eyes, Clue let the wind brush against his face and tangle his curls even more. It reminded him of Toga asking to tidy his hair, and the chill reminded him of the fan Debbie always insisted on sleeping with. The distant chatter was almost like Koda's mumbling whenever he got so engrossed in a book and started reading the pages out loud, while the quiet let him feel like being around Toshi and how they always had a calming effect for him. "I don't know if I should talk you down or let you enjoy the night," the voice behind him said. "Nah, I'm just thinking," Eraser Clue responded, not yet ready to leave his piece. Eraser moved closer to the edge and sat a few feet away from the vigilante. It wasn't an awkward silence, but it wasn't exactly comfortable either. Before Clue could think of anything to say, Eraser spoke up to his relief. "So what were you thinking about?" Well, that was a loaded question. He could either reveal his identity or play it off, deeming the latter to be the safest option. He hummed, "My family. I didn't do enough research and failed to protect them," he said bluntly, before adding, "They're all physically okay." But still, Eraser was quiet for a minute after that, but seemed to be lost in thought, so Clue let the silence spread between them. It took about a minute longer for the hero to speak. "And why is it your responsibility to keep them safe?" Clue tried to form words but just couldn't. His mind whirled. How could Eraser say that? Think that? Eventually, he managed to gather enough to actually speak. "They're my family. I promised to protect them. I can't go back on that promise," he said defensively. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying that sometimes we mess up, and protecting people isn't just sheltering them from anything potentially bad. It can be helping with the aftermath of it too." The hero still hadn't looked away from the city. His eyes scanned everything so he could be ready to act. "And from what I understand, respite is more than just your brother holds everything up. It's a support network where you all look out for each other." Clue hesitated. "My brother." He was staring at the hero now. Eraser let out a huff. "You didn't think we'd miss how similar you and Izuku are, right? We thought you were the same person, but you've been in the same room together, so our next guess is brothers." Clue sighed. Yeah, it wasn't quite a confirmation. Just an acknowledgement that Clue had been seen beside Izuku, even if it was thanks to Toga. "You know, I think you're right about the support network," he mused. "Actually, that helps. Thanks, Eraser." The hero pulled his goggles up and let a feral grin spread across his face before a crash followed by explosion sounded in the distance, and both the hero and informant jumped up and ran to see what had happened. Debbie was worried. Izuku had disappeared after the incident with Birdman. He'd never spoken about it, but he didn't have to be a genius to know that Izuku was running from his past when he opened respite. He knew that the kid had gone out as his Clue persona, so he should be safe-ish, but it didn't stop him from worrying. Especially since all he could really do was distract the others. Koda and Hitoshi seemed okay enough. Toga was aggressively throwing knives at a dartboard. She seemed like she needed company. Making his way over loud enough for Toga to hear, but not so loud that he'd get Hitoshi's and Koda's attention. It made sure he didn't get accidentally stabbed at least. "You okay?" A knife hit the target and she went to collect it and the two others that were already lodged in the board. "Just fine," was all that he got in reply from the blonde. Remembering what he used to do to comfort his sister, Debbie waited for Toga to speak. I just shouldn't have stayed quiet when I didn't like him, but Izuku liked that he accepted him for being quirkles, and he's done a lot for us, and I don't know what I should have done, but I wish I could do something different. Another knife hit bullseye. I should have protected Toshi from being misgendered. Her face fell for a moment before hardening again. Another knife. I should have stabbed him before he could hurt them. She aimed a knife, but instead she let it fall from her hand and land on the floor at her feet. I should have done something. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks as Debbie opened his arms and let Toga cry into his shirt. Izuku returned to the cafe a few hours later to see Toshi, Debbie, Toga and Koda watching share together with Olive pressed against Debbie's side for the warmth. He was about to slip past when Toshi met his eyes called him over. They didn't look too mad, but Izuku didn't know if they were just hiding it. He'd understand if they were upset, but it wasn't obvious what anyone was feeling, and that scared him. He walked over as Debbie paused the show and fell to his knees. I'm sorry I missed all the red flags with Chisaki. I understand if you're upset or angry, and I take full responsibility for my mistakes. I'm sorry that I missed how uncomfortable Toga was around him. I'm sorry that I didn't realize that Debbie was protective of us around him. I'm sorry I let him stay around and that had led to the cafe being unsafe. From now on I'll make sure I do checks on any regular customer to make sure the cafe is as safe as it can be. He breathed out, eyes clenched shut, waiting for anything. But nothing back came. Instead he felt arms wrap around him and looked back up to see Toshi awkwardly hugging him. They let a hesitant smile make its way onto their faces. They thought about what they were about to say. That's okay. As long as we're family, we can get through anything. Debbie let a shit-eating grin out. Toga smiled with happy tears in the corners of her eyes. Koda grinned and Izuku had to hold back tears as everyone piled in for a group hug. They still had things to work through, but at least they all had a supportive family. Chapter 20. Katsuki stared at the empty seat in front of him. Dick had disappeared overnight. Damn nerve had even moved house without telling him. It pissed Katsuki off. As if that wasn't bad enough, the old hag hadn't heard anything from Auntie Inko either. He liked Inko. She was nice and never hit him like his old hag either. It was just Dick who was annoying, always following him around and muttering. The useless idiot was probably flagged on concrete somewhere. He'd seen the Quirkle statistics and he wasn't stupid. At least he didn't have to put up with the nerd anymore, but he didn't like not knowing. The bastard should have told him before disappearing like that. His phone buzzed in his pocket, so he pulled it out and clicked on the notification. Apparently some criminal who'd been put away about a year ago had gotten out looking for a victim to kidnap and kill. TSK. Stupid villains. At least when he was a hero no one would have to bother worrying about shitty villains escaping, because he'd kill them all. He'd make sure none of them even wanted to escape again. He'd seen All Might when he was a kid, and ever since then he wanted to be bigger, more popular, more rich and even more powerful. He'd be the best hero and everyone would know his name. The lesson passed like usual. Teacher announced the same old shit about high school entrance exams. Katsuki took the opportunity to announce that he was going to UA. Then the rest of the day went on. He got all perfect scores on tests and even got a free lunch by beating up some weird kid with a villain's quirk. Going home was when it all went to shit. That crappy slime villain freak that broke out earlier in the day managed to find him in a back alley. The extras that always followed him around proved to be useless too, only running off. Not like he needed help. But they were still stupid, useless cowards. Less than a minute later, he was drowning, breathing in the sludge while heroes stood around. Their quirks didn't suit the situation, but he still didn't need any help. Sparks ignited in his palms, but they were too weak. His sweat was all absorbed into the overgrown sewage creep. He felt the air pressure drop suddenly. Nothing was working. His quirk was gone. He didn't have a quirk. He was useless. He was a dig. The sludge stopped moving around him, letting him see a figure. They didn't look like a hero, but the other heroes didn't seem to be doing anything. A detective looked like he was holding them back. The figure was short. Their costume looked really dark but had accents of color. He couldn't tell. His brain couldn't process what he was looking at. He only just managed to hear without his hearing aids. God, why did he not have stupid spare batteries in before the damn extra attacked? Let him go 3 words. Was that all he was worth now? He was quirkless. A rumbling feeling pulled on his limbs and Katsuki assumed the villain was talking. You're not the first one who's threatened that. The figure said something else, but a combination of the voice danger and pain didn't let Katsuki understand that part. All he knew is he was suddenly dropped and rolling onto his stomach to try and cough, but something in his throat was stopping him. The figure moved forwards and dragged him back to the sidelines of the fight and began first aid so he could throw up whatever that slime shit was. He vaguely noticed Death Arms was moving forward, slamming a metal trash can over the sludge and containing its eyes and mouth. Don't get him wrong, he was glad to be alive, but fuck if he wasn't pissed off. Who the fuck thought that they were strong enough to fight without fighting? Did they have a villain's quirk that let them fuck with someone's head? Whoever stepped in was probably just as shitty as Dig. Discreetly changing his batteries and slipping the hearing aids back, he had a chance to breathe. Something dawned on him. Hey! Why did you almost let me drown? He yelled at the heroes. Trenchcoat moved forwards, but a voice beside him spoke up. Chuka. He glared. Why did they almost let you choke? You weren't drowning because you inhaled the sludge, and it wasn't suffocation for the same reason. It was a substance between solid and liquid that got trapped in your windpipe, so you choked instead of waiting for a response. The figure stood up. Next time don't use your quirk. It only got in the way with that. They walked away while Katsuki's eyes grew heavy and his breath shallowed. He fell back onto someone as his consciousness slipped away. Izuku didn't know how to feel. He'd saved someone from a hostage situation and assisted in a rescue and arrest. But why did it have to be Bakugo Katsuki? He'd moved on from his past, but today made him rethink a lot. Sending a quick glance to Eraser, who was now trapped by an unconscious Pomeranian, and dropping a note for the hero, he left the scene to go home and collapse. Hopefully his family wouldn't hate him. Hopefully they'd let him apologize and let him fix his mistakes. Shada was confused. Clue hadn't seemed like himself even after rescuing a civilian. Instead of giving off the caring presence, he had been stone cold. Correcting a simple mistake of a traumatized teen and leaving before knowing that the victim was okay. Sure, there were a lot of heroes, but he'd managed to get Tsukauchi to give him a temporary permit to be on the scene, had the heroes moved civilians from seeing him and given a grave support strategy for capturing the villain. But he still seemed distant and cold. He didn't like being in the dark about anything, but Clue remained in mystery. All he knew was that he had family in respite, and was very protective of that family. Then was the thing he said to the civilian, don't use your quirk. It only got in the way. Clue hadn't physically interacted with the villain at all, only spoke to it. He wanted answers, but all he got was a letter that told him to go to respite if the hero wanted more information, but not to bring any of the Spotlight heroes. Clue was a mystery. Maybe that's where he got his alias. A series of clues that make no sense until you fit them together to find a bigger picture. Eraser wanted answers, but right now he needed his cats and a cup of coffee. This is the end of the episode. Thanks for watching.